This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are interviewing the head of Machon Shiloh, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Harav Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
There are many Jews who speak of a policy of land for peace, and some rabbis support this policy. Do you support or reject such a position?
Before going into the details, we should mention that, as with any theory, the proof of a theory is in the outcome. This position of making all kinds of concessions to the Arabs, peace agreements, accords, etc., in order to achieve peace, this policy has been tried on a number of occasions, beginning with Camp David in the late 70s, continuing with the Oslo Accords in the early 90s. There were many other agreements and attempts along the way, and concessions were made on different issues in order to convince our enemies that they should make peace with us or accept our existence. And yet the fact is that none of these things have worked. The Egyptian government, the Egyptian press, both in the past, both under Mubarak and under the present regime of the Muslim Brotherhood, was always and remains entirely anti-Israel, anti-Semitic in every way. This is not a secret. This is well known. One can read it every day in the Egyptian government-controlled press. The same is true of the Oslo Accords with the so-called Palestinians, most of whom were never from Palestine to begin with, most of whom are the descendants of Arabs from surrounding countries who entered Eretz Israel starting in the mid-19th century, who came here looking for jobs and prosperity once the Jews began returning and building up the country, as was documented at tremendous length by Joan Peters in her book From Time Immemorial. All these agreements, all these accords, all the concessions have led to only one thing, and that is more terror, war, missile attacks, violence, terror, etc., etc. So even those who once believed that this kind of policy should be tried, even if they admitted, as some of them did, that it involved risk, but it was, in their view, a risk worth taking, well, we've taken the risks and we have seen the results. And the results are not pretty. And the results prove that this theory has no basis in fact. So, of course, being someone who likes to think, at least, that he is logical and rational and does allow facts to influence his opinions, I reject such a policy out of hand.
How does one respond to those who claim that the halachic principle of pikuach nefesh, saving lives, requires that we be willing to cede land to the Arabs if this will lead to Jewish lives being saved?
First of all, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a theory. It has been tried. Much land has been relinquished to our enemies. Much of Eretz Israel has been lost already because of this policy, and yet it has not saved a single Jewish life. In fact, it has done the exact opposite. It has resulted in many thousands of Jews losing their lives. It has resulted in 10 to 15 or more thousands of Jews being very seriously injured and maimed. It has terrorized millions of people, and perhaps more serious than all of the above, it has weakened our deterrence and belittled us as a nation and caused our enemies, and even those who perhaps were not our enemies around the world, to think much less of us rather than more. Having said that, the claim itself even if there were truth to it, and there is no truth to it whatever, that relinquishing land brings peace, the claim is based on a very pernicious notion. Why is it pernicious and dangerous? I will explain. If according to halakha, if according to Jewish law, when a neighboring country says to the Jewish people, to the government of the Jewish people, we demand a certain parcel of land, we claim it is ours, if you give it over to us without a fight, all well and good, and if not, we will go to war. And of course, in warfare, the way of things is that people die. If we use the halachic principle of pikuach nefesh in this very inaccurate, improper, and distorted manner, and claim that in order to save Jewish lives, to prevent such a war, we should and must in fact give land to our enemies, land that has always been historically the national home of only one nation, and that is the Jewish nation. If we adopt that position, then of course we have to respond to such a neighboring government or nation that yes, we will give you this piece of land because we're peace-loving and we wish to save lives. Now, fast forward the tape, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. What happens if the next, another government, another country, or the same country perhaps, the same leader comes along and says exactly the same thing? We demand this land over here, you have to give it over to us, or we will go to war. Again, if we understand the concept of pikuach nefesh, of saving Jewish life, to mean that in such a case we are to acquiesce, this means that we must of course agree to this demand, this threat. And then we would have to give away that second area, that second parcel of land. And so on. The next time such a demand was made, whether it was a year or 100 years later, we would have to do exactly the same thing, because theoretically, according to this claim, the principle of pikuach nefesh requires us to act in such a manner. In fact, we have no choice, because we are trying to save Jewish lives. The end result of such a policy is clear. It would be the eventual destruction and annihilation of the Jewish people in their land, or certainly of the Jewish state. Because every time that land was demanded, we would have to hand it over. And therefore, piece by piece, the Arabs, our enemies, or anyone else who made such demands, would slowly but surely whittle us down until we were living on the beachfront of the Mediterranean, and then they would demand that as well, or they would go to war with us, and we would have to agree, of course, because it's pikuach nefesh. And that would be the end of the Jewish sovereign entity in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the point I'm making is this: no country, let alone a Jewish country, no country could ever survive if that was its explicit and formal foreign policy. No country could ever agree to be blackmailed in such a way by its enemies and constantly hand over land bit by bit until eventually it would cease to exist. That is a prescription for suicide, national suicide, not for peace and not for saving life. If there are certain rabbis, Torah scholars, who claim that this is the position of the Torah, then in practice what they are saying is that the Torah, by definition, is opposed to any sovereign Jewish entity ever existing in Eretz Yisrael. Because according to their version, their understanding of the Torah, Jewish national existence, sovereign existence in the land of Israel is incompatible with the Torah principle of pikuach nefesh, which is of course absurd. The Torah tells us in the book of Shemot, chapter 19, book of Exodus, it tells us, "Vatem tiyuli mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh." You shall be a holy kingdom or nation to me. A kingdom, as mentioned in Torah, a mamlacha, in modern parlance, is a state. The Torah tells us to enter Eretz Yisrael. It talks about Yerusha, about inheriting and making it ours, being the ruler of Eretz Yisrael. It talks about V'yirishtem ota v'yishavtem ba, you shall inherit, take control of it, and dwell therein. That is what the Torah tells us. If pikuach nefesh means that whenever someone chooses to threaten us with war, with violence, we immediately are required to give up some of our land, then none of that makes any sense. None of that could ever make any sense. It simply could not be. And this shouldn't surprise us, because those rabbis who express such a view, that pikuach nefesh requires us to give up land, supposedly for peace, which we know is never the result of such concessions, such rabbis do not in fact believe in the idea of a Jewish sovereign presence, a national presence in Eretz Yisrael. Or, put another way, if they believe in such a thing, they believe in it in a vague and very unclear and ill-defined way. That is to say, they believe that at one point in the future, when this miracle worker that they, in their minds, believe to be the Mashiach, the Messiah, comes along, then these things will come to pass. But in the meantime, we are unable to establish, and certainly to maintain, a country, a Jewish nation, Jewish nationhood in Eretz Yisrael, because we are always required to follow the principle of pikuach nefesh. So therefore, by definition, this policy, this understanding of Torah is opposed and completely incompatible with the true thrust of the Torah. It is therefore the product of Galut mode Judaism. It is the product of a very limited and very poor and depressing, in fact, version of Torah Judaism, which we must learn to reject and to overcome, so that we are able to perceive the Torah as it should be, which is the Torah of the Jewish people living in their land as a sovereign nation, as the Torah commands us. And therefore, in that context, if we are threatened with war, if we do not relinquish some of our land to our enemies, the proper response is exactly that which was given by Yiftach HaGiladi in Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, to other nations, other enemies of that time who demanded part of our land. And he said, if you wish to make war with me, well then you will receive our response, our military response. You will suffer. Do not risk it. And if you do risk it, know that you will lose, and that which you lose will not be given back. That is the rule, has always been the rule of human existence, of political relations between nations. And in this case, we're not just talking about land that is won in battle, but we're talking about land that is, in essence, from time immemorial, ours and only ours. That is the view, and that is the only possible view of authentic Torah Judaism.
Thank you, Harav Bar-Hayim.